January 15th is celebrated as Army Day in India. But do you know why? In 1949, on this day, on January 15th, General Cariappa became the first Indian to take charge of the Indian Army. It was a historic day for India indeed. And today, we would like to talk about KM Cariappa, the first Commander-in-Chief of the Independent Indian Army. We will hear about it, about his journey from the eyes of his son and Air Marshal KC Cariappa. A warm welcome to you, sir. Field Marshal KM Cariappa can not only be regarded as the architect of the modern Indian Army, but also as a man of many firsts. Could you please tell us about those landmark moments in his life?
Quite honestly, when you talk about those landmark moments in his life, what I am aware of, in terms of first-hand knowledge, is the fact that he was the first Indian commander-in-chief and wore his rank on the 15th of January 1949, as you mentioned. Before that, he did have a number of, shall we say, successes, like being perhaps the first Indian officer to, I think, attended Staff College in sometime in 1930 or 32, around that time, in 1942. And beyond that, he also, in 1945, he was probably the first Indian brigadier when he commanded what was known as the Banu Brigade in the erstwhile Northwest Frontier provinces. At that time, he was in Banu itself, and he earned a name for himself because of his humanitarian attitude towards the locals, towards the tribals. And there is a story, and this I think was something that he wasn't even aware of after, because of the honor given to him, was when he, on a particular mission, he was driving through the frontier and he saw a string of women carrying pots on their head. And he stopped, and through an interpreter asked them where they were going. And they said, "We're walking so many miles to get some water." He was quite shaken. And the following day, he ordered his troops to excavate well in the village. And this was recognized many years later when a park was named after him. And he was referred to as Khalifa because of by the locals, because of his humanitarian attitude towards them. The other thing, of course, is it is said, I think he's mentioned it too, that when Nehru, who was not yet prime minister, and visited that area, where he was taken to a place where he was received and warmly welcomed by the local tribals because of father's influence. However, when he went to the adjoining brigade, he wasn't allowed to talk to the locals. So it was a question of father's attitude towards people that I think is one of his greatest achievements and successes, if you might say.
That gets me to the next question. Generally, great generals can often be jingoists too. What kind of human being Cariappa was? A patriot, I'm sure. A nationalist, of course. But was he a pacifist at heart? Please take your time to answer this question. It is very important for our listeners to know this point.
I'm not too sure that he was a pacifist at heart, Trisha, but I do know this, that he was always advocated a strong army. At that time, the Air Force and the Navy were not as significant in sort of supporting arms for the army in those years. They were certainly, at least I'm talking about in the Indian context. And perhaps, in fact, when he did talk about the need for a strong army, he was sort of roundly castigated and criticized. Like Gandhiji, we don't need an army here. We're a peace-loving country. Who are we going to go to war with? And Gandhiji had wrote out a paper, I think it's called the Harijan, if I'm not wrong,
Yeah, yeah,
in which he criticizes father's expressions
yeah,
about the need for a strong army. And in
yeah.
fact, I've got the book in which this whole anecdote is related by a biographer of Gandhiji's. It's called, the book itself is called Mahatma Gandhi, The
Mm-hmm.
Last Phase by Pyarela.
Okay.
Are you familiar with that name?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in this particular book,
Mm,
uh, according to what it says here, General Cariappa of the army, in one of his utterances in England,
mm,
had allowed himself to
mm,
say that non-violence was of no use under the existing circumstances in India.
mm.
Only a strong army could make India one of the greatest nations in the world.
Yes.
Joined issue with him in Harijan. Generals greater than General Cariappa have been wise and
Mm,
humble enough, frankly, to make the admission that they have no right to speak of the possibilities of the great force of ahimsa. And
mm,
so it goes on. Now, the father, as he later sort of said, then took it sportingly. And on his return to India, he called on Gandhi.
mm. Yes.
And in the first week of December, on the eve of taking office, it's been December 1948.
Okay.
And this was their first meeting.
Mm,
It was Gandhiji's day of silence,
mhm,
and he was busy with on his charkha.
mhm,
Declining to take a seat on a chair that Gandhiji had offered, the general respectfully sat on the floor.
mm,
I have come here to receive your blessings, he said to Gandhiji. Gandhiji scribbled on a paper saying, "You know something of my having written in my paper about your statement on non-violence in London last month."
mm,
General Cariappa smiled and said that he had seen it and had felt greatly honored that the Mahatma should have taken trouble to notice at length the views of a person he had never met. Coming to the point at hand, he said, "We soldiers are a Malayan community. Even you think we are a very violent tribe," and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, when that was I think the first and the last meeting that Father had with Gandhiji, and he went off to whatever the Kashmir war was raging at the time. But no, it had died down now because on the 1st of January 1949 was a ceasefire,
yeah.
much against the will of the army, particularly.
Mm,
And by then, 30th of January 1948, Gandhiji had been assassinated.
yeah.
So it was in the ceasefire was after Gandhiji's assassination, if
Mm,
I'm not wrong.
mm,
And so that was that. No, father was not a pacifist, but he certainly felt very strongly about a need for strong Indian armed forces,
mm,
and the need also to make sure that the frontiers. And
mm,
he was very suspicious of the Chinese even then, though he had never had any truck with them, any dealing with them, saying that they did cast a covetous eye over all of Arunachal Pradesh and extending even into now Myanmar.
mm,
There was also some rumblings in Ladakh and in the central sector, but it was in Arunachal Pradesh that he was greatly concerned.
mm.
Because basically,
Sorry.
go ahead, go ahead.
Yes. So he was a very peace-loving person. That's what comes out to the biography that was written. Very lovingly. It's a very moving tribute by a son. Um, and tell us a little more about this book.
No, I didn't. A lot of your sentence was garbled just now.
Okay. Your book, Field Marshal K
Yes.
is described as a moving tribute by a son who regrets he was unable to spend more time with his father, the father of the Indian Army. Could you tell us a bit more about what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I can't say I was really inspired to write the book, but I was arm twisted, I think, more by your father and his editor then editor Deepa Chowdhury, who said that I should write it, and I was very reluctant to do so because I didn't really know my father, and I said I can't do justice to a person. I mean, who's admired and acknowledged as being a fine human being, a fine officer and gentleman. But as I said, they prevailed. And then I interacted quite a lot with Deepa, and I then decided to do some amount of research, or as much as I could, in National Archives, the Army Archives, talking to people. But I still feel, even today, 13 years after the book has been released, that I haven't done justice to his persona, because I've met a lot of people after that who said, "Oh, did you know this? Did you know that?" There were anecdotes in his life and how they respected him, how they looked up to him, and which I felt would have been useful and appropriate to be mentioned if I had, um, as I said, spent enough time in really researching his life and times.
Hmm. But your book also has many rare photographs of Field Marshal KM Cariappa's life and work. How did you go about sourcing the material of the book and putting it all together? I'll,
But yeah.
the cover itself is so beautiful. I wanted to show this to everybody. It's one of the most beautiful, very impactful covers I've seen. So, yeah.
What would where I got these? I think a lot of the photographs are given to me by friends and family, and the letters that you are showing just now were
Yeah.
things that father had kept over the years. He maintained a diary, for example,
Uh-huh.
which I don't think I mentioned in the book, of the time that I was a child,
Okay.
and now that of course was I think when he arrived for my passing out parade in
Uh,
1957 in Jodhpur. He was
oh.
invited by then Air Marshal Mukherjee, who was Commander in Chief of the Air Force,
Mhm.
or Chief of the Air Force, to commission me
Okay.
on the 29th of May 1957.
Okay.
So, but coming back to the photographs, I said some were he had some in his in albums. Some I received from people who were close to him.
Mm.
As I said, he maintained a diary when I was a brat, and I
Mm.
must have been about a few months older, maybe a year or two old. And he expresses his concern about my having an upset stomach and things like that.
Mm.
And those had been kept and stashed away in a wooden truck, and I quite by accident I came upon.
Okay. That's
And
interesting. But then also tell us a little bit about some of the anecdotes in the books. What is the most inspiring anecdotes in the book? I I've heard this one episode so many times. There's so many people. It was when you were a prisoner of war. I think in while I think 1971 war,
1965.
1965. Okay. So could you narrate that incidents for us and also some of your favorite other incidents and
I
anecdotes?
cannot actually because I wasn't around.
Oh,
See,
okay.
I was shot down on the
Uh-huh.
last day of the 1965 war, on the
Uh-huh.
22nd of September.
Uh-huh.
And after that, I was virtually in a state of oblivion and incommunicado as far
Mm-hmm.
as India was concerned. I was
Mm-hmm.
in spent some amount of time in solitary confinement. Eventually, joined up with the rest of with the other prisoners, Air Force and Army. And even after I was repatriated, and we were the Air Force officer repatriated 4 months later, I wasn't aware of this particular anecdote that you're referring to. It
Okay.
then came to my notice. I can't remember who said it,
Uh,
but when father was apparently asked
mm-hmm.
or told that I was a prisoner of war, he happened to be in Delhi, I gather, on that day. And Ayub Khan rang up the Pakistan High Commissioner and said, "Look, please pass on this message to General Cariappa. His son is being taken prisoner. He is well. He's being well looked after." And father's supposed to have turned around and said, "They're all my sons. Look after them all equally well." And Ayub also asked if he would want me to be repatriated straight away. And he said, certainly not. And I talking for myself, I would never be able to live with myself should something like that have happened. So we were all in it together. And I have no sort of regrets about having been taken a prisoner or whatever one went through. But that was father. And I think this particular statement of his had a huge impact on a lot of people who sort of believed that he was always an Indian first. And as children, we were taught, when you were, who are you? And I said, I'm a Koro, I'm a Kur. He said, no, you're first almost an Indian. And then you whatever you are. But now all that's gone out the window now. And we're all we're so state conscious, so petty-minded nowadays, that he'd been very unhappy. He was in his years. Politicization and indeed to a large extent post that period, the politicization of the armed force.
Any other interesting event that you'd like to share?
Offhand, I can't really think of. He had a lot of very close friends in the diplomatic community. There was the two particular names that come out to my mind. One was a Russian ambassador, a gentleman by the name of Novikov, Novikov, and the Egyptian ambassador, Ismail Kamel Bey, and we used to call him Uncle Camel or something like that. But he was close. He's close friends with the French ambassador. But his basically, Trisha, his entire when he was in Delhi, that photo, the cover photograph you show, there's a painting on it. It was done by the wife of the British High Commissioner at that time in 1949, 1950. The British High Commissioner and the Army Chief's house were side by side, and so either the High Commissioner's wife, Lady and I, would come in through the hedge and get him to sit for a portrait, or he would go across and sit for a portrait. There were none of these 10, 15 foot high walls and gun-toting desperados protecting the individual. And so that was it's a prize photograph because I think it's the finest painting I've seen of his. It's so typical of him.
Yeah. So I read this article in one of the newspapers which contained a signed note by Field Marshal KC Cariappa. It spoke about his views on military rule in India. That happened much later, I'm sure, around the 1971. Could you tell us a little bit about his view about this thing? And
But the sad thing is this, that during those years, and I'd say this, actually it goes right back to day dot, because I was a child, there was so much age difference, because we never, ever got to talk about anything that had to do with current affairs, national events, international affairs, and then being in the Air Force, I spent a lot of my time, or we spent very little, I put like very little time with him at home in and he himself wasn't here very much. If I came on leave, I would spend, he'd be here maybe for about a week or so, then would stay with an uncle because father was going out on tour to somewhere or the other. And this thing about military rule, I don't think he really meant military rule in the sense of having a military dictator, a la Ayub Khan or a la the General Sukarno in Indonesia. Apart from it, he said, all he suggested was give in the process of settling down, let the army look after the handling the administration of the country. And he certainly didn't want a kind of banana republic situation to come up where the army specifically would be holding all these plum posts. And in doing so, the army gets corrupted. Because you don't do a good thing, you say, why do I want to go and lose sleep over this, that, and the other? And this, unfortunately, has been the undoing in Pakistan from the time that he became president. the armed forces, particularly the army, were given plum posts in small little towns, etc. They became administrators. Excuse me. And in the process, probably lost the zeal to be professional soldiers. he had never once said, no, army rule per se. Let the army help in running the country, but never army rule.
Yeah,
I'm aware.
yeah.
Sorry.
Would you like a glass of water?
No, I'm all right. I'll manage. Are you going to give me one?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if he were alive today, well, how would he have reacted to this India-China clash that is happening now?
How he would have reacted, I don't know, because in his case, in his views, I think it's a deja vu. He saw it happening. He saw it happening when he was commander in chief. He spoke to Nehru about it. And he said, or maybe a little later, as did General Samaya. And I think Nehru is supposed to say it's not for the army to tell us who our friends are and who we should be prepared to go to war against. He refused to believe that. Nehru refused to believe that we would go to war. He always looked upon Pakistan as our main adversary. And so all that I can't really, maybe father would have said it, maybe he wouldn't have said it. But to turn around and tell you, I told you so. And in fact, because of his views were well known about China. And before he went off to Australia, it was either the governor of Tamil Nadu or the governor of Assam who suggested, father used to be known as Skipper.
Yeah.
And saying, it is such a pity you're going off to Australia. You should be appointed as governor of Assam to look after and care for and provide guidance for the defense of that entire state. But I think Nehru was quite apprehensive about father's popularity. I don't see why. And this is now, he went off to Australia less than a year after he retired. Okay. And he was paranoid about the army taking over the country just because next door we had Pakistan, across the sea we had Indonesia, and so he was, and Nepal was always under the sway of the Ranas. There was a king, but the Ranas were always calling the shots. So with that in mind, I think Nehru just wanted him out of the country. But to come back to your question, he would have probably privately have said, well, it was quite obvious that this was going to happen in 1948, 49, 50, the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And but he was never a little person, never a small man trying to say, oh, but I told Panditji this, or I told, because he was close to Panditji at one time, and they were just falling out. After he had retired and he called a spade a spade. And which is why I don't know if this would be a question that you're going to raise about the fact that he stood for elections. The question, he didn't stand for elections twice, it was only once in 1970 when he was guaranteed by the Swatantra Party, at that time headed by Rajagopal to stand for them. He said, no, I will not stand for any particular party. I will stand as an independent, provided you guarantee that I will not have any, I'm going to be fighting against the Congress. You guarantee that I will not be, the rug's not going to be put under my feet. In the event he lost.
Yeah.
And he didn't have the kind of money that people talk of now that politicians have. And he had friends who either provided him with a car or on one or two occasions maybe an aircraft from place to place. But at no stage did he have the kind of enormous funds that are obviously doing the round.
You also mentioned about General Samaya. That gets me to my next question, and perhaps the last. We all know that Sam Manekshaw very well respected KM Cariappa, and even General Samaya had were in very good terms with him. Could you tell us a few stories about their shared history? I think that's an important, interesting question. Because
about their what?
Their shared history with KM Cariappa.
All right. Well, militarily, I can't say too much where General Timai was concerned, but to go back into antecedents, his clan and ours is the same. In fact, his grandfather and my grandfather, I think, was stepbrothers. So we
Okay.
were related, right? And General Samaya was the complete antithesis to my father. He was he was great fun to be with. He was fun loving. He enjoyed. He would sail. He played golf. He did this, that, and the other. And he looked upon me, almost like a son that he didn't have. On one occasion, when they were in Kashmir, he was in fact between him and Dad. There was a master. I think this was planned the Zojila operations,
Okay.
and it was found that a lot of secrets well, the discussions were somehow being passed to the Pakistan government because but this was before father became commander in chief. He was now army commander. There was
Okay.
a British who was the army chief, and he and the Pakistan army chief were called Gracie, were great pals. So a lot of information was being passed on till when the army got wind of this, they decided to carry out operations secretly without informing the army chief, commander in chief at the time. Was hurt and he went battling to Nehru. So Nehru said, I don't know about it. Now, one of the great successes was the fact of the Zojila operation, when they got the tanks up. And there was this great General Rajendra Singh, who was then a colonel, took his tanks up and all masterminded. The basic thing was there was General Thamai, who was commanding the division, and so that was one great interaction that they had. Father was army commander, and General Thamai was. On one occasion, when my father was visiting in Kashmir, um, he may have been command brief by then, and General Thamai was accompanying him. He pulled out a cigarette and wanted to smoke. So father said, "You can't do that in my car. We'll stop." And he got the driver to pull over, stopped for a while. General Thamai smoked his cigarette, and he went back and he said, "Sorry, sir, it won't happen again." But though we were the same family, I don't know how close they were, except my father was fond of him, and because of this closeness, I would spend a lot of time with General Richardson. And which was time I was quite unwell, and I was pulled out of school. He was commandant of the Indian Military Academy, and I spent a month with them in Dehradun before joining my father, where Jan Timaya had taught me how to sail. I learned how to ride a two-wheeler, a scooter as a cadet. But I was very close to the fond of it. Where General Field Marshal Sam is concerned, I don't know what the closeness militarily or professionally is, but I know that father had a lot of respect and time for him, particularly post 1971 and the way he handled it. And there's an interesting anecdote where when father retired, and I was posted in Wellington at the Defence Services Staff College, and father had come to stay with us for a short while. Field Marshal Sam had invited him, and Mrs. Manisha was also alive at that year, that invited him to bring some dinner at their place. And so when we drove into the name of Field Marshal Manishaw's home is Stavka, which means headquarters. STAVKA, as you probably are aware. And Field Marshal Sam received Dad at the and he said, "Sir, notice I've got my jacket buttoned on." Now, the story about the jacket being buttoned on, my father always believed that if you were wearing a coat, so all right, you're sitting down, you can have your jacket unbuttoned, coat unbuttoned. If you stood up, it had to be buttoned. And if you notice a lot of times, you see all these foreign dignitaries, all of them. The only exception, I won't call him a dignitary really anymore, is Trump, who goes around with his jacket unbuttoned. But every single other one, irrespective of where he's from, his coat is unbuttoned. So father would go up to a person and say, "Look, I've got a new hobby." "Yes, sir, General, sir, what is it?" Said, I started collecting buttons. I see you have no need for your buttons. May I? He pulled out a pair of scissors and may I cut it off? So sorry, sir. And that was something that was so typical of him. And the other thing that I would like to share with you, and that is the fact that there's more of it to do with his persona. That in his pocket, wherever he went, he had these huge cavernous pockets in his jacket. He had a needle and thread. He carried a small candle. He carried wine. He carried a pair of scissors. He carried safety pins, and he always carried sweets. and to meet with the children. So there were times when he would park on the side of the road driving from here to Bangalore. You see, drop at a village, see little urchins playing around, and he
Okay.
had this vertical car, and he sort of beckoned them, and they would didn't come anywhere near what who this big man was. Eventually, he pulled out a couple of sweets, and then first the some boys would come running up. Eventually, the little girls also came,
Mm.
and he would try and talk to them in Kannada, which he had. And he pulled out looked at a little girl, and then pull out a mirror which he carried.
Mm.
This is what you look like. Why don't you go to school? He said. Then the next thing he would do is pull out a comb and comb the girl's hair, and
Okay.
then show the photo picture again. Doesn't this look so much nicer? So she, blush and smile and very coyly take the sweet and go rushing back to tell her, don't tell your mother, always blush and comb your hair.
Yeah.
He was that sort of a person. And he loved children. He cared a lot for them. And he always carried sweets. And he was a great favorite
Yeah.
among the kids. So that was it.